Hey everyone, Nimesh Patel, aka Psycho Bob here again, and this is part 2 of the Claptrap model build for Gamespot UK. Before I get into the video, I wanted to try and answer a few quick questions I've seen on the Gamespot website, their YouTube channel, and also some private messages that have been sent to me. The most common of them was, what's the final model look like? Can you show us some pictures? Well, there hasn't actually been any shots of this yet, as it wasn't ready at the time the first video was uploaded. These videos are being created and uploaded alongside the actual model build, so the footage you're watching is actually where the model build is. Rest assured though, by the end of this video, you should see the finished article. The next question was, how big is the model going to be? Well, from the edges of the longest pieces, the model will be roughly 19 cm tall, 8 cm deep, and 15 cm wide once it's been fully assembled into its pose. There will also be a USB cable coming out the back to power the LEDs, which will be roughly 1 meter long. Hopefully that's answered some of the questions you may have had. With that said, let's get on with the main part of the video. In the last video, it ended where I had uploaded the model to Shapeways and had just placed the order. So this is where you play the waiting game and wait for the parts to be printed and shipped to you. Normally this is done within 10 working days, however, as luck would have it, Shapeways had some printer issues at the time I placed the order, so things took a bit longer than normal. Shapeways customer service is, however, very good, and they minimise all the delays as much as they could for me, so I was very grateful for this. The day had finally come when the Shapeways boxes had turned up, and I could finally take a look at all the printed parts. Everything was accounted for, but to my surprise, there were two parts that weren't printed exactly how I expected. The hubcap and the wheel spoke pieces were supposed to be printed as one part, but when it arrived and I had to look at them, they actually had been printed into two separate pieces. This was something that needed to be corrected as early on as possible, or I would be facing difficulty later on. So I prepared the surfaces, and then I used some extra strong glue that melts the plastic and fuses them together for a very strong bond. I also checked over the other pieces, and there didn't seem to be any other issues, so this meant I could get on with the cleaning and smoothing stages. When the white strong and flexible parts are printed, it's made from a nylon powder that's melted with some lasers in the printer. The melted powder then fuses together to form the printed plastic parts. Because of this process, the final surface has a sandy texture to it, which I then need to smooth out, but there's also unmelted powder residue stuck to the model at the same time. Shapeways cleans off the majority of this, but they don't always get everything, so I always clean the parts myself once I receive them. This is so I don't run into issues later on when the paint tries to adhere to the surface of the part. When the frosted detail parts are printed, they are printed slightly differently from the nylon pieces. These are printed as extruded material, and they use a wax-like substance as temporary support. Again, Shapeways tries to clean off the wax support material before shipping to you, but I always find there's a fair amount of wax support material stuck on the part when it arrives. This definitely needs cleaning off, as nothing sticks very well to this, and even if it does manage to stick, the final paint job can be damaged very easily if you leave it on. A picture on screen should show the wax material stuck between the blades of one of the vent pieces, which I had to clean out very carefully as the pieces were very thin, and also the frosted detail material isn't as strong as the nylon material. Once the cleaning stage was done, it was time to start sanding the pieces to smooth them out. This is by far the most tedious part of the process, but it's well worth the effort when you see the final results. I'll start with priming the surfaces and then using a coarse grit sandpaper before repriming the piece and then moving to finer grit levels. This is repeated about 3 or 5 times, moving to finer and finer grit sandpaper, depending on the roughness of the piece. Now I'm afraid I don't actually have a lot of video footage for the painting section available, as one of the SD cards I was capturing footage on corrupted beyond recovery on me. I do have some pictures available however, so hopefully that will suffice for this section. The process I followed for this was to first start by painting on a rust layer. Claptrap being out in the middle of nowhere on Pandora for long periods of time and having bandits taking pot shots at him all the time meant that he's not exactly going to be the most pristine of conditions. So I used a dark brown mix as a base, then I used lighter shades of browns and oranges to make a very basic rust coat. I didn't spend a lot of time on this as it was mostly going to be covered up, but it was worth doing these subtle shades of browns and oranges in case they actually showed through on the next section. I used an airbrush for a lot of the paintwork as it allowed me to get a good even coat and also apply some very subtle weathering that you can only really achieve with an airbrush. Once the rust layer was finished, I then proceeded to go over this layer with a yellow paint job and weathered it so you could see the rust layer below it in the form of some chipped paint. Most chips I created revealed the rust layer, but I planned it so some of the chips revealed some silver metallic paint. This was to represent fresh damage. It was then finished off with a subtle dirt layer that went over the top of everything to show that the base of the body was dirtier than top. For the parts that needed to be weathered but were supposed to be chrome, I used a dry brushing technique. Normally you use very little paint on the brush when you do this, but I chose to make this a bit brighter by loading more than normal onto the brush, as I didn't really want a very dark weathered look for these pieces. The most obvious places where I used this technique was actually on the wheel spokes and the various parts of the arms. With the paintwork completed, it was time to add some decals to add some extra detail that are near impossible to paint. For the most part I didn't actually need that many decals for this model. I had already manually painted on the thin red and white stripes that ran over the top of the model, and also the white stripe that runs around the chest area. The only details I needed to add was the danger labels near the shoulder panels, the bolts on each of the chrome patch panels that run around the body in general, the red warning label, and finally the audio synthesizer. I made some custom decals in Photoshop and then printed them onto some decal paper, which I then transferred to the model. I'm afraid, like the paint section, a lot of the circuit footage was lost on the corrupted SD card. The circuit I created was kept relatively basic. I created a simple parallel LED circuit that was to be powered by the USB cable. I could have built a serial LED circuit where the components are chained one after the other, which is much more simple and also a lot less expensive, but I always opt for making parallel circuits if I can help it. Parallel circuits are much more redundant, so that if one LED or component fails, the others in the chain will continue to function. In a serial circuit, if one LED or component stops working, any component after that in the chain stops working. Right, so I think I've been prattling on now for far too long. If you made it this far without forwarding, you have my thanks. Before I shut up and let you enjoy some footage of the finished piece, I just wanted to offer my congratulations in advance to the person who wins this. I put a lot of time and effort into this, so I really hope you enjoy the model. So for the last time, this is Psycho Bob, and without further ado, here's the completed model.